I'd had a couple of homosexual experiences when I was at university. I married in my late 20s. It wasn't as though I was in the closet, popping out and having unacknowledged affairs behind my wife's back. Nothing like this occurred. So for 30 years, I had had no contact with this world really whatsoever.
On the day of that first ministerial briefing, that was about to change. The New York gardener had just been diagnosed at St Vincent's.
And I always remember the then Chief Commonwealth Medical Officer coming over, and when we asked about this new problem, well, he said, well, Minister, whatever else it is, you can be sure that it's not a virus.
Of course it's a virus.
The problem with HIV is that where it chooses to deposit itself is right in the heart of your immune system.
So it's both an attacker, but it demolishes all the soldiers that you recruit to try and overcome the infection. So, I mean, you couldn't get a more efficient killer.
Within days to weeks of being infected, the virus is in every organ of your body. And the disturbance is largely in the gut, but it's in your brain and your liver and everywhere else.
And add to that a 10-year average incubation period. So anyone who's infected with it has just been donated a 10-year opportunity to infect other people.
Well, at the time Neil Blewett was being briefed, we knew none of these things. We didn't know it was a virus, we didn't know how it was transmitted, we didn't know its natural history, and we didn't know any treatments.
Other people approached the new mystery illness from a different angle.
When the doctors call it the gay plague, then people said to me, well, do you think actually God has sent the disease? Is it actually punishment? The Bible is fairly explicit about homosexuality.
Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, thou shalt not lie with mankind, as with womankind, it is abomination.
Abomination is a very strong word. It means something God hates.
Fred Nile was not a joke. One of the great problems in the United States had been in the 1960s when these people started to first emerge. They had been treated as a joke.
There would be some there who are homosexuals who feel that we are against homosexuals. We are not. We feel that homosexuality is moral perversion.
And in the early 1980s, there they were at the heart of the Reagan administration. AIDS represented, for the American religious right, a huge political opportunity to cement and consolidate their political power in the United States. It must have seemed to them heaven sent. And people like Fred Nile in Sydney thought they could do the same thing here.
250,000 voters swept the Reverend Nile into state parliament. One of the first issues he raised was the new American illness, the gay plague.
They said, Fred's inventing this new disease to frighten the homosexuals. We know he's opposed to their lifestyle, now he's trying to frighten them. But they realised later that I wasn't making it up, it was a sad fact of life.
The gay disease. Well, that's what it was, the gay disease. I mean, who'd ever heard of a gay disease?
How homophobic can they get? What depths will they stoop to? We honestly didn't think it was about us. You know, we were healthy young men living reasonably healthy lifestyles.
Bill Botel was spending his working week in Canberra, but his weekend's back in Darlinghurst.
Becoming a little hysterical because on one hand the city was still partying and everything was going on as it had, you know, freedom and dance parties and music and lots of riotous behaviour. On the other hand, this problem seemed to be emerging out of nowhere that seemed to be having really bad effects on the health of gay men.
Morning there, how are you?
One by one, people were falling sick. Not travellers from New York, Sydney men.
We began to know people who had this disease. One of the first amongst them that I knew was Bobby Goldsmith. He was part of that wider tribe of people I used to go out with and party with and dance with. And
I went home with him once and he was a little spunk and a really friendly guy and a really nice guy.
And you could see him go from a healthy young man to somebody who was very sick and emaciated, and that was very disturbing.
Theories ran wild that the illness was caused by snorting too much amyl, or ingesting too much semen, or some extreme new sexual practice that must have come from America.
How is it transmitted? Through kissing, through sex? Didn't know. I mean, was it like influenza, that you'd get it by coughing over somebody? Nobody knew. You would expect it to be sexually transmitted, but we didn't know, so we couldn't give advice.
To the doctors at the Taylor Square Clinic, it seemed a dead ringer for a sexually transmitted disease.
The first man I told almost fell off his chair laughing when I suggested that condoms might be a good idea.
Unfathomable. The idea of having to wear a condom during sex for any reason while two gay men were having sex was just not even outlandish, but so unnecessary. We couldn't get pregnant, and that was part of the way we had fun, because we could just splash anywhere.
If this was a new STD, Basil Donovan's other clients took an immediate professional interest.
There isn't a sex worker on the planet who wouldn't want to use condoms. Why would you not want to use a condom? If you had 6 men up you in one night, can you imagine what that's like? But clients pretty much controlled the shots, and that was to pretty much insist on a condom-free service.
So even if a handful of people were sick, it was business as usual in Darlinghurst and the Cross. Unseen, the virus ran rampant.
There was a background concern, but no, there was no perception that in fact thousands of people were becoming infected each year.
Some suggested the new illness might be carried in the blood. If they were right, one small group didn't stand a chance. People with haemophilia used a treatment every week, which came from several thousand blood donors.
Well, it was rather terrifying, and I don't think the doctors were comfortable either. It was a case of, well, we're quite sure that in Australia it will be different. Of course, as it turned out, it wasn't.
Everyone was confused. When the Red Cross asked specific groups to stop donating, some gays insisted they had a civil right to give blood.
We felt, well, yes, we can understand that perhaps people feel discriminated against, but we felt discriminated against in terms of we also had a right to survive and not to be infected.
It was in itself a worry if in fact we're not going to get collaboration from the gay community.
David Pennington became the government's chief medical advisor on AIDS. This was his first encounter with the gay community.
There was never any question about us being timid or passive in relation to the medical profession. We were always going to be in there.
Elsewhere, that fighting spirit was paying off. After a decade of agitation, the abominable act of buggery was decriminalised.
The very point we're facing an explosion in the health area, you're actually legalising the behaviour for which it can be spread. I mean, it just didn't make sense.
A few months later, science settled the cause of AIDS. The new human immunodeficiency virus. Now there was a test to see who was carrying it.
The people up at St Vincent's decided to test all the blood we'd stored in one go.
When we tested the 1,000 men, we probably expected a very small proportion because most of the people who we tested were well.
We had 400 positive men.
We were somewhat overwhelmed by that because that meant we really had an epidemic.
Well, if you can imagine telling several hundred people that they've got a fatal disease, and these were healthy young men generally, who were terrified of this very